the way that these behavioral breakdowns will work is that I'm partnering with really smart people who have a ton of expertise and are trying to help people with certain behaviors that I also find really interesting. And so the way that the behavioral breakdowns will work is that I bring them on and then ask them questions about the specific behaviors they're trying to help people with. We're going to do some analysis on it. So it is very much a conversation, not a presentation. Hopefully that was clear to people when they signed up. But I'm super excited because we have Dr. Alaina Szlachta. Did I do it right?
Yay! That's exactly
Yay!
right.
Okay, fantastic. Dr. Alaina Szlachta with us today, who I bumped into on LinkedIn, who is saying some really smart and I think helpful things around the challenges with evaluation specifically. In particular, the fact that we seem to be kind of running in a circle on evaluation, which is we know it's not good enough, but we also run into some really organizational, barriers when we try to implement it, but we know it's not good. And we keep trying because we know it's not good enough, but then we run into barriers. And so we kind of keep, I think, circling around more effective evaluation strategies. And I think there's a bigger conversation to have on that. But we wanted to focus this one in, the having a tight focus on a particular behavior or set of behaviors is usually helpful in these circumstances. And so the one that Lena suggested that I love is the whole issue of getting better evaluation data and specifically things like getting people to respond to surveys and that sort of thing. So I'm super excited that you're here. Thank you so much for joining us. And Elena, do you want to just introduce yourself really quickly and say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Wonderful. I'm thrilled to be here, and I cannot wait, Julie, to hear what sort of suggestions you have for me and for everybody else here around getting people to give us better data. Surveys are the number one way that we collect data, but for better or for worse, in the learning and development sector to use for measurement. So I like to tell people that I'm a big data nerd. I mean, I have used data as an asset my entire life, personally and professionally. And so I've really fallen in love with data for the value that it can add to our lives and more importantly to the work of learning and development because we really do, like Julie said such so eloquently, we are stuck in this like strange circle of we make progress, then we get stuck and we maybe make some progress, maybe we take a step backwards or two or three, maybe the CEO changes, maybe the merger acquisition happens. There's so much that goes on that makes data collection, measurement, and evaluation difficult for learning. But I love that we're focusing on one thing today, which is getting people to respond to surveys, because I
Right?
think that the suggestions of how can we do that more intentionally will be really helpful. So I'm eager to be here and hear what you have to share, Julie.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we get started with this, the model that I lean on a lot when it comes to the idea of applying a behavioral science in our learning and development world is this model that comes from COMBE, and it's specifically part of what's referred to as the behavior change wheel. Dr. Susan Mickey and her team out of University College London Center for Behavior Change kind of devised this model because what they saw is that there were a bunch of like little models popping up all over the place around behavioral design. There was stuff coming from, healthcare and public health. There was stuff coming from some other verticals. There were like things that were specifically addressing motivation or specifically addressing habit formation, things like that. And so what they tried to do is take they did a survey of I want to say like 19 different behavioral design models from social science and kind of streamlined it into a single kind of overarching framework so that we could get a little bit more kind of apples to apples in our conversations and especially looking at what's effective in the research literature and all of those kinds of things. And so the model that we came up with is the idea that if we're hoping that we're going to help somebody with a behavior change, that they need kind of three basic things. And it seems really simple, but I promise there's quite a lot of depth in it as we go down. But they need to be capable of doing it. Like they need to have the knowledge or the skills or the ability or the psychological stamina or whatever it is to do the thing that we want people to do. They also need to be motivated to do it, right? And in our busy, busy, busy worlds, motivation is becoming more and more fraught because even people I don't think I'm alone in thinking that even stuff I genuinely 100% want to do, I just don't have time for every day, right? I feel like we've all got like 37 things we need to do with every minute of every day. And if you can't get the motivation item into like the top five, it's just not happening, right? Like it's just getting bumped, kicked down the road a little bit or things like that. So people don't have time to do even the things that they genuinely want to do. But so motivation becomes super important because it's not only got to like get onto people's lists, it's got to get up somewhere near the top of people's lists. And then the last area is opportunity, which is really looking at, does the environment support the behavior? It might be the computer system, it might be, the framework, it might be the distribution, it might be anything about, it might be the physical environment they're in, any of those kinds of questions. And does the social environment support the opportunity? So do you see the behavior modeled? Do you have examples? Is it being supported by other people in your network? Do you have, accountability partners, or do you have somebody reinforcing it? All of those kinds of things. Each of these kind of has a subcategory. Physical motivation, we don't worry too much about. I mean, that's something that shows up more if we're trying to get people to do a psychomotor task or something, like if I want people to exercise, more physical capability will come into play. But psychological capability is, like I said, knowledge and skills. For motivation, we've kind of got two types of motivation that we're talking about. One is reflective motivation. Like, is this something that accords with people's values? Is it a goal for them? Is it something that they're aware of having, some sense of purpose about? Is it something that they think is part of their job responsibility or any of those kinds of things? I think there'll be some interesting conversation to have there. Automatic motivation is habits, biases, it's all that stuff that kind of sits below the surface a little bit and maybe we're not consciously aware of, but still impacts our behavior quite a bit. And then, as I mentioned, opportunity is usually split between physical, which is, like I said, systems, environment, things like that, and social, which is what's the social support for stuff. So when we're talking about this, Alaina, let's just put a little bit of draw a little bit of a box around this. We're specifically talking about like surveys to get people to give us maybe feedback data on a learning experience or things like that. Is there anything more you would sort of describe in terms of what you're picturing?
Yeah, I would say a couple of common examples of surveys that we see people using are engagement surveys, like your annual employee engagement survey. I don't think that we get really good response rates for that overall, which isn't necessarily about learning, but the responses that we get do influence what we provide to support employees.
Mhm.
Other examples are exactly what you mentioned. There's probably numerous surveys that people might be using throughout the learning experience, anything from sort of a baseline survey that people might take at the beginning of a course, especially in the e-learning dynamics. I think we include a lot of surveys in e-learning, but don't get great response rates. And that's getting baseline data around behavior, idea, motivation. And then, of course, at the end, asking people about what was their experience like, reflecting on their learning. So there's a few different ways that we might include surveys in our overall learning experiences and within the organization. But
Mhm.
getting people to respond to the surveys in the various ways we might use them, I think our response rates are at best 15 to 30%.
Right.
I also have had an experience where we were able to change the survey response rates from like 15-ish% to 75 using
Mm.
some strategies that Julie might be coming from this model that I didn't know were strategies. So, yeah, but getting that number up because the more data we have that's also honest, the better decisions and changes and adaptations we can make to make learning more impactful.
Yeah, and I would imagine that when the response rate's quite low, one of the things we're getting is a certain amount of self-selection bias in
Right.
the people who do respond, right? Like we're not getting a full picture of the learners. We're getting the people who are willing to respond to surveys, which by all, without much prompting or, support, and by
Mhm.
definition, maybe they're not the typical,
Right.
or
The
the most
data is not
typical.
going to be fair and
Mhm.
representative for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like capability is probably not going to be our biggest category, so we'll just go ahead and start at the top and kind of talk about that. Is there anything like in terms of when it comes to responding to surveys in particular, is there anything that we really is there anything that we really would want our learners to have that maybe they don't right now in terms of skills or in terms of knowledge or, things like that without getting into like too much into the motivation space of, those kinds of things. But is there any kind of skills or capabilities that they would need to be able to do this behavior or to be more effective at doing this behavior?
So I'm going to add another layer because I think that when I think about good surveys, there's two ends of the spectrum. There's the creator of the survey, and then there's the person who is giving their data within the survey and completing
Mhm.
the survey. So
Yep.
I don't know that there's too much capability challenges for users. Because
Hmm.
we're so used to taking surveys and we can use there's so many modalities. We can use our phones, our laptops, we can physically fill out surveys. All of those things are accessible. But I think where some of the capability challenges might lie are in creating quality questions. On the side of the professional who's creating the survey. And I don't
Yeah.
know if that's something we can get into, Julie, if that's appropriate within the context of
You know
this,
what?
but yeah,
There are no rules. We absolutely can talk about that because I think
yeah.
it is a piece of it, right? Like we've got so basically we're saying it's two behaviors. What, right? We want the people to respond to the surveys, but prior to
Mhm.
that, we really want the people who are creating the surveys to be creating, good quality questions that make it as likely as possible. Because honestly, we can fix, we can fix learners, but if we can fix the system, that's usually more
Mhm.
certain. And so giving people
Mhm.
really good questions up front is
Mhm.
probably going to do more than trying to, persuade learners on the back end that they should fill out
Mhm.
bad questions, you know,
Yeah,
things
yeah,
like that.
exactly. Yeah, I think
So,
mhm.
oh, go ahead.
Just the relevance. I think there's, for me, in the capability, the thing that I see that's missing a lot in creating questions and then the user experience of I'm reading these questions in this survey, relevance. Like
Mhm.
and this might be getting into motivation a little bit, but I can imagine that if the creator of the survey isn't hyper thoughtful about how are we using the data that we're getting,
Mhm.
and then making sure the questions are created to give the data back that's the most useful, has the highest utility and therefore relevance. If that's missing, I could see that that would influence the motivation. So if the creator of the survey isn't capable of creating questions that would deliver useful, relevant data, at least that the user sees that the data is relevant to their jobs, to improve their lives, et cetera. If that gap isn't filled and those questions aren't answered, then I think that will negatively influence motivation. So the capability that I see that we could really improve is making sure our survey creators are really thoughtful about how are they going to use the data that they're getting and even communicating that. Here's why
Mhm.
we're collecting the data. Here's what we plan on doing with it even before we ask people to complete the survey. I think that capability, if we address it, would make a huge difference.
Yeah, because I mean, I think this does get into the motivation thing and what's the incentive for
Mhm.
what's the incentive for the person to fill out fill out this survey.
Mhm.
Like I tend to, I mean, I think we've all got a certain amount of survey fatigue, which is absolutely like a physical environment, piece
Mhm.
of it, right? Like we're all getting
Mhm.
bludgeoned with kind of constant surveys. And I understand why all these businesses want them, but everybody's like, I'm tired, I'm busy, I can only do so many of these. And so
Mhm.
usually my motivation for filling out like a survey for a business, which is a different thing, but is somebody that, gave me really like exceptional service or really good
Mhm.
experience or, things like that. And I want them to get credit for it. And so that's usually the main driver on that stuff. But then I will get into these surveys and I'm like, oh, you're not giving me the ability to do that. I had one where, like I think it was something particular that had happened on a flight. And so then Delta's like, tell us how our flight went. And all it gave me were kind of those net promotery kinds of like, how likely are you to recommend this? And I'm like, oh, well, I came over here to say that the flight attendant was amazing and handled a difficult situation well. And there's no way for me to do that. So now I don't care.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, I think that's such an interesting one, and I think this is something that you and I've talked about when we were doing, kind of the pre-conversation, but also I've had this conversation with another colleague of mine who does measurement and analysis, which is it's very. it tends to be very much a one-way street, and I
Mm-hmm.
think this is very much a motivation issue, not really a
Mm-hmm.
capability issue, but it tends to be a one-way street. Like it's an extraction thing. We're gonna extract this data from you, and
Mm-hmm.
like they kind of don't, I mean, occasionally there's obviously an extrinsic motivator, like, hey, enter to win an iPad or something like that.
Right.
But it tends to not be clear how any of this data will either benefit or, and I think what you're saying, which is, what is it even going to be used for? What are we going to do with it?
Right. Right. Yeah, and I love the idea, and I know we're sort of moving ourselves into motivation, but acknowledging, I think there's a lot to be gained by just acknowledging, yes, we have 10 surveys a year, or yes, there are this many surveys throughout the learning experience, but here's why we're doing it, how we're using them, and then how we're going to give the data back. So I think going that linking between capability and motivation is that thinking through as the user, how are we going to thoughtfully give the data back to
Hmm.
participants of our surveys such that they can grow, advance, feel heard,
Hmm.
whatever, thinking about that as we're creating the survey, how do we give the data back thoughtfully? I think will boost our motivation for users and combat some of the negativity that people might have around it. So I love that you're mentioning that opportunity.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting because I think a lot of surveys, like the format of it and how kind of cold and clinical they feel, does
Right.
communicate to me that you don't really care what I have to do. You're just trying to,
Mm-hmm.
populate your data, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not, this does not indicate to me that, like, I am my opinion about these things and my feelings about these things and whether it worked for me is genuinely valued. So, yeah, no, that's really interesting because of course that goes to the motivation piece as well,
Right.
you know. And it never feels like it's coming from a human. It always feels like it's coming from a spreadsheet, you know. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so those are both kind of interesting factors as we look at motivation, because like I said, the main reason I'm usually motivated to fill these things out, which I think creates my own data bias in the sample, in that I tend to only want to fill them
Mm-hmm.
out when I have like nice things and feel like I would
Right.
like to help the person who did it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, yeah, no, that's really.
Here's another thing that I think could be interesting. Again, we're making this strong link between capability from the creator and
Mhm,
motivation of the user, which is, I think, not talked about enough. But going back to the capability and the design, really, this is a
mhm,
design thinking. Like when we create surveys, there's a real thoughtful design component. So not only are we
mhm,
designing for how are we going to use the data, but we should be designing for how are we going to give the data back? But the other thing that we should be designing for that also ties closely with motivation for the user is the right time and the right
mm,
format. So, Kelly, for example, is saying, if a survey uses long-winded, stuffy language, I'm going to skip it. But what if we have a survey and we take a few questions throughout one long survey and we facilitate that in a conversation, or we think about when's the best time to collect this specific data within the learning experience so it feels natural and intuitive, because I think so many of us just have a survey at the end of something. Like Gary
mhm.
asked, is there going to be a survey at the end of this webcast? Well, we instead of that, we could have actually placed strategic questions where we're asking for people's feedback throughout our conversation. It's still a survey, we're still collecting data, but we're doing it at a time when it's more intuitive and natural versus, like you said, more clinical. How do we make data collection feel more natural and organic? I think will change then the motivation. So we can design for that upfront as well. Another capability component.
No, that's super interesting because, I have back in the day, I had some backgrounds. I won't claim that I'm like, I'm still as currently knowledgeable as some people, but I kind of a UX background and,
Mm-hmm.
user experience, usability, human computer action, all those kinds of things. And one of the big important things that that's kind of, I think, just a cornerstone of UX practice is user testing, so that you can see people
Mm-hmm.
reacting to things in the
Mm-hmm.
design in situation, right? Because if you ask
Yeah.
people after the fact, they're not going to remember what problem they had on the second page. Like that's just not a realistic thing. And so that
Mhm.
timing piece is super interesting. And I mean, obviously, like I said, the way we solve for it in usability testing is to actually, watch somebody work their way through your product, which
Mhm.
big fan of, highly recommend. But also the question of capturing, reaction data sort of as you go, as opposed to waiting all the way to the end
Mhm.
you know, for specifics on it. Have you seen good examples of that, or have you seen people who are doing some of
Oh
that
yeah.
effectively?
Well, myself
Yeah.
and I've done it in a couple of different ways. So before I went out on my own and started a consulting practice, I worked at a nonprofit and then a large for-profit, and we were able to do what I call data enablement, which is we ask some questions at the right time where I talked about using a conversation to collect data. And so, for example, at the start of a program, if it's a, let's say, continuous, let's say, couple of weeks long program where everyone's getting back together, they've had some time apart, let's say that your call to action at the end of one module or lesson or workshop or class, your call to action was to go have a conversation with your supervisee and ask them, how is work going and how can we better support you? Let's just say that's the call to action. Well, one good example of collecting data to see, did people take action? How did it go? What did they learn from it? Is at the start of your program as like an icebreaker exercise to say, hey, your call to action was to go have a conversation with your team or one of your supervisees, ask them, how's it going at work? And what can I do to support you? What did you learn? And so that could be small group discussion. That could be, a type form where you have an anonymous responses, but you can see people typing in their responses and you can see how many people are responding to the question versus how many are in the class. So you know that you're getting some good data back. But I think, again, there's a design component to what do we want to know that's going to help us understand, are people taking action? Are they applying what they're learning? Where are they getting stuck? What more would they like to know, or what more would they need to be supported to do the behaviors that we're teaching them? So I love using icebreakers as a way of collecting data, but then I'm
Oh, nice.
using that data to be
Hmm.
able to see how are people taking action compared to what I expected them to. So many of us, we give homework and then we ask people, did you complete your homework? But you don't have to ask them that question. You can ask them a question that's an icebreaker that will tell you if people did the work or not. That's more relevant to the conversation than just asking them, did you do this? Yes or no. So I think again, it's a design thinking opportunity. That's like, what's the most useful data for me as the person collecting data, but for the user to help them continue their learning journey. And so
Hmm.
reflection and processing questions are great data collection for us, but they're also great for the learner as well.
Right, right. Yeah. So, no, I love that. So the timing thing would be really that kind of physical opportunity. It would be part of the physical opportunity thing, like asking
Mhm.
people kind of at the right time as opposed to, hey, remember everything about what you just did and give me some
Mhm.
kind of feedback. I'm interested in, and I've seen some examples of it that I felt like were maybe a little bit over complex, but like, if you're creating an e-learning program, can kind of thumbs up or thumbs down, content on a particular page or, like,
Mhm.
do a quick, like, oh, I had a
Mhm.
strong reaction to this, either good or bad, can we
Mhm.
give you the opportunity to tell us about it right there so that it's
Mhm.
in the context of the thing that you're doing rather than like waiting till the end and hoping you remember some of the things that you would have liked to have communicated to
Mhm.
the author of, the materials or things like that. With the
Yeah.
reflective motivation, like I said, one of the pieces of this is this kind of question of identity, and role and goals. And so, how do you feel like most people view, obviously we're going to generalize a little bit, but like, how do you think most people sort of feel about their responsibilities and their role and, what goals they have around these kinds of surveys when they get them?
Well, I wonder, and Julie, you've actually mentioned this. I think it was in your Talk to the Elephant book. Um, if if surveys are an afterthought, which I think for so many of us, back to what you said about motivation, we don't have time. We never have enough time. It's probably our
Mhm.
greatest barrier, both for survey creators and for people taking the surveys. But if survey design and evaluation is this afterthought, it's like, oh, yeah, we have to do this. Let's think of something really quickly to put together. That's just not going to generate good data. It's going to perpetuate low survey responses. It's really obvious from the user's perspective. If people sense that this survey was an afterthought, then they're not going to take it as seriously. So
Mhm.
this really goes back to there is a whole design thinking around data collection, especially in the context of a learning experience, that when there's thoughtful design behind what we ask, when we ask it, and how we use the data to facilitate learning and reflection, et cetera, it's a totally different thing. And so I think there's probably a few camps of people. There's one camp of people who are, oh yeah, I got to get this survey done, and it's an afterthought. So there's
Mhm.
some changes to be had there. And then there's a camp of people who know they could be doing it better, but they don't have the time to do it better.
Mhm.
And then there's probably the camp of people that know they could be doing their survey design better, and they just don't know what they don't know about, well,
Yeah.
what do I focus on to improve it? Time may or
Mhm.
may not be the issue. It's more like, I really just don't know what I could be doing differently to make this a better experience. So I think from the motivation perspective, there's a few different layers. Like, I know I could be doing this better, I don't have time, or those that are just like, it's an afterthought and it is what it is. I don't care.
Mhm.
So I think that's
Yeah.
probably my honest perspective on that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and because I think there was a push, especially with things like net promoter scores and stuff like that, to make it like fast, 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 fast to try to get under, like I sort of see that as like slipping under the motivation bar in the sense of if we make it easy enough, we don't need people to be super motivated. They'll still just give us answers. But then the
Mm-hmm.
challenge for that is, this whole question of like it doesn't necessarily feel meaningful at a certain point, right? Just
Mm-hmm.
telling people, telling a company how likely I am to recommend, Delta Airlines or something to, my
Mm-hmm.
friends is like, oh, that feels very not meaningful to me. And, I
Mm-hmm.
am gonna skip those because what do like, I don't care about answering it. I mean, I understand that like the ease of answering is a good answer if all I need to do is press one of the happy to sad face, like leaving the, airport bathroom. I was just traveling, you can tell, because all my
Mm-hmm.
references are travel
Yep.
related, but like make it as easy as possible. And but that's something where like specificity is not super important. Like if a bunch of people are like the bathroom is unhappy, they'll go and
Mm-hmm.
investigate and figure out what it is, but they don't need like somebody to be detailed about what the issue is. But in other cases, we do need that detail. We do need some of that, specific information and things like that. Do you feel like with the automatic motivation, one of the questions I kind of had is, do you feel like we sort of train people to ignore surveys or to not, to answer them quickly without kind of paying particular attention? Like, did we build that muscle in our audiences and now we're dealing with it?
Yeah, I think yes, absolutely. I would say that there's a culture around surveys and data collection, and that culture probably differs depending on the context. So there's probably a culture within the learning and development department around what's the norm, what's accepted around survey creation, survey response rates. There's probably a norm or a culture within different departments of your organization, within the organization overall. And then, of course, contextually, like if am I traveling and being asked to respond to questions, there's these different cultures that we probably have. Going to your motivation, the things that are beneath the surface, we
Mhm.
probably step into a different feeling and idea around responding to surveys based upon where we are and what we're doing, but we probably don't know that that culture and that bias exists, but it absolutely influences how we respond to surveys. So I'd be curious, again, back to the design component as the person creating a survey, which is probably all of us here. We're all creating surveys at some point, but we're also all taking them. So what's nice is that we have the user experience of our own to go, well, that sucked, and how do I make it better? Or if that survey was terrible, here's what I could do, what I think could be done differently to make it. So we get both ends of the spectrum, which is great. Um, but investigating what's the culture, or even being able to
Mhm.
name it. Like, what is the culture of how learners respond to surveys in our department? Or what is the culture of people in the organization when they respond to our annual engagement survey? Are they like, oh God, this again, no one's going to use the data? Or are people
Mhm.
genuinely excited? Oh, this is my chance to communicate what I'd like to see the organization invest in, because they actually take the feedback seriously. And like, this is my time to share my ideas, and I can't wait to do that. So, what is that culture? And how might you then, with that recognition, do something differently to make that culture facilitate what you want, which is better data, honest responses, and people feeling at least neutral around
Mhm.
surveys, if not the negativity that we all have at some time or another.
Yeah, no, I like what you're saying about that because I do think that, obviously we've all had surveys for something like maybe a public workshop where you realistically might not have touch points with that person ever again.
Mhm.
Like you're gonna, you know, even if it was all positive, you still may not. There may not be an ongoing relationship there, but within organizations, and especially something like, the employee engagement survey, which happens annually or something like that, like if you are putting data in and literally never seeing anything that kind of tells you where it's going, what it's being done, that somebody's actually paying attention to it, any of those kinds of things, well, of course you're going to like, oh, I put all this time and effort into answering that last year and I never heard boo about it. And so now why would
Right.
I, continue to invest that effort? So yeah, I think that's really interesting when you have an ongoing relationship with your audience, how you're communicating that back and what, here's what we're doing about it. Have you seen some of the organizations you've worked with to kind of do a good job of that, or do you see better or worse kind of ways of handling that?
Well, I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that one of my most proud moments was when we took a course that had a 15% response rate, because they had a couple, they were in the habit building. Like, their whole course was around building better habits for real estate agents to
Hmm.
get better, like, sales in the end. Like,
Hmm.
so, but the habit building thing was a real component. And then we wanted to collect data throughout the course to understand, here's the things we're recommending that you do. And it was a consecutive program where people would go back week after week, and they were supposed to be doing these habits every week, do these things. And then we would troubleshoot, how's it going? Where did you get stuck? Where didn't you have the time? Because we were nurturing those habits. And originally, people just wouldn't, they had, as someone mentioned in the chat, how long after a program do you ask them or send them a survey? And so in this particular course, the 15% rates, they sent the survey at the end of the live workshop. They didn't want to take the time to have people respond during the 1 hour, because they were like, our hour is so precious. We don't want to use the time. And they accepted, well, we're going to get lower response rates, but we don't want to use time to have people respond to the survey in the hour. And I said, wait a minute, is it really acceptable to have 15% response rates? Because you really don't know how well people are building habits, and you can't use that data to tell the success story of your program because the data isn't robust enough. There's
Hmm.
no integrity in 15% of people saying something. No one would take that seriously, or you'd have to lie and say to your prospective learners, this is what 15% of people said, but that's not representative. So I convinced them to build in those questions from the survey. I encourage them to shorten the questions. What's most important? How are
Hmm.
we going to give people that data back? And we built in the questions. They could see the answers coming in. So we had 100 people on a virtual call coming in, and we could see everyone's responses to the things that they were asked to do the week before. How many of you did
Hmm.
these things? And then we had two open-ended questions. For those of you that did most of them, what helped you to do the work? And for those of you who responded, no, I didn't, what got in the way? And then that data became a conversation point that was part of the learning. And so that's where we got to 75% response rates with the same type of questioning, just facilitated and designed differently. And then it changed the culture, because then people expected that they were going to be asked about the things they did the week before. So it encouraged them to do the behaviors because they knew they were going to
Hmm.
there's accountability and as part of that. And then they also knew that they were going to get feedback for those that didn't do the work, what got in the way. And then there was time allotted to then troubleshoot that. Oh, I really got stuck with this, or this technology tool didn't work, or my boss wasn't supportive. And so those were actual conversations to help people do the work to build those habits. And so they were rewarded by sharing their data because
Hmm.
then they got personalized feedback. So it's a culture thing. How do we create a culture where people understand that their data is being valued, they're getting good feedback and opportunities to grow and excel because they're giving their data? That's a complete culture shift. And of course, that 75% response rate was a direct result of shifting the culture and the experience of how people give and take data throughout learning. So I just love telling that story because we
Yeah.
shifted the culture, and that's what changed the response rates.
Right. Well, and I love it because I love a lot of things about that example, but I love that it's got that social component, right? So now if I
Mm-hmm.
can see other people answering this question,
Mm-hmm.
that creates that,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what a lot with, I think what you're talking about with the culture piece, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
do other people take this seriously? Oh, maybe I should
Right.
too. And it feels like there's this sort of virtuous circle of if you fill out this data, you know that somebody's actually reading it and processing it and taking it seriously, and we're seeing
Mm-hmm.
change based on it. And so that
Mm-hmm.
that can kind
Yeah.
of create again that virtual, that virtuous circle on it. It feels very Peter Senge of me to, or not of me, but very Peter Senge to kind of think about it in those terms rather than
Yeah.
just because like one of the things I'm working on some evaluation material right now for something, and I think there's lots to understand from something like the Kirkpatrick four levels or whatever, but they often get talked about as like just a thing that you should do,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm always kind of like, what's the if you collect this data, what decisions or what are you going to use it to make what decision? And
Mm-hmm.
having those statements kind of up front of
Mm-hmm.
an evaluation or data collection. And I get that sometimes, we're it's a little bit more of a fishing expedition where we don't know what we don't know, so we're going to ask questions about it. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, like there should be some purpose. You shouldn't just collect, level one data because you're supposed to collect level one
Right.
data.
Exactly.
It's gotta go
Yeah.
somewhere and do something. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah. There's a
super.
couple of questions that
Yeah.
are in the chat, that this whole component of timing.
Hmm.
Kelly, I think at the very well, she was the most recent response. She's surveying managers 1 month later and 6 months later after a learning program. And I think this is really interesting. Like, when do we survey people? And what are we asking them? Because I can imagine that if you're surveying managers 6 months after a program, there's a lot of time and there's a lot of other things that could have influenced those outcomes. And so, what are we asking at 6 months? Why 6 months? What are you going to do with that data? And so, just this component of when is it the best time to survey people, it all depends on what are you doing with the data?
Hmm. Yeah.
And are we using the data to facilitate reflection? Are we using the data to understand how people are applying learning? I don't think we have to wait 1 month or 6 months to get some of those indicators. So to me, the when do we survey people is all about
Hmm.
when do we expect change to happen?
Right.
And so the example I suggested of, we have this cohort, they meet every week for a certain amount of time, and we're actually asking them to change their behaviors throughout the program. We would ask them every week about those behaviors and how is it going, because we expect change to be occurring. They're not going to perfectly have a habit formed, but we're working with them to nurture those habits. And so the change is then taking those actions at a higher occurrence. And so for us, what we were looking for is how often are you doing these activities at the baseline? And then every week we would ask them the same questions, and we were looking for a trend line to positive in an upward direction. We just want to see them taking those actions more consistently as the
Hmm.
program goes on. I don't need to wait 1 month or 6 months for that. But all of it is about what change do we expect to see in
Hmm.
people? When do we expect that change to come about? And then what data collection, what questions could we ask? What observations could we do to understand, is that change happening? And then why or why not? And how can we help to facilitate that change and use the data.
Hmm.
Like, I love this question. We expect you to do this thing. Did you do it? And then if you did it, why? What helped you? If you didn't do it, what got in the way? Because with that data, I can do something with it immediately. My supervisor doesn't give me time to do this practice. I can do something about that. So to your
Hmm.
point
Yeah.
about, the Kirkpatrick levels and even the ROI methodology, is that going to give you the data that you need to support
Hmm.
your employees, your community, your team to do the things that we're expecting them to do and facilitating that change?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not trying to bag on Kirkpatrick or anything like that, but at the same time, you know, that's a different conversation. But at
Yeah.
the same time, like ROI kind of gets talked about like it's like, of course you want ROI, and it's like, well, but what are you going to do with it, right? Are you going to make budgeting
Mhm.
decisions? Are you going to, make changes to the structure of your curriculum? Like, are
Mm.
you going to do something different with stakeholders? Like, what are the things
Mhm.
that you're going to do depending on what these numbers say? Do you have a sense of, kind of course of action? And I can see like a 6 month making sense in terms of we want to know we had a good effect right after the training, but we'd like to see if it persisted, right? We
Mhm.
did training on people giving feedback. Are they still giving feedback a month later or 3 months later or 6 months later? Or are we
Mhm.
seeing a real drop off in this? Is it something where once they figured it out, they were like, oh yeah, this is great and we're going to keep doing it? Or is it something where unless we refresh it, it's going to fall off? Like I can see timing for some of those kinds of things, but at the same
Sure,
time,
sure.
I think this asking the question of what's the path out of this that we see for people and when would they be
Right,
able to answer these questions most
right.
effectively is really like I'm thinking of like customer journey mapping, which is a thing that again that
Mhm.
kind of shows up in the UX space of like
Mhm.
thinking what's the journey that I expect to see people kind of
Mhm.
emerging from this learning experience,
Mhm.
and at what point would like okay, this is something that they're going to learn that's going to be effective on projects, and projects typically come up at about a 6 week mark. So
Yes.
some people might not be
Yeah.
able to use this for a month or two.
Right.
That will give us a pointer of when to ask that question.
Yeah, and at
Um,
the same time, Julie, why would we train people on something they're not going to use for 6 months or
oh, I
six
know.
weeks later?
Yeah.
Yeah, so a whole other
Well,
design component. Yeah, there's a lot
yeah.
of answers to that, but fundamentally, from a behavior change perspective, it is absolutely not a recommendation to train something that people aren't going to use
Yeah.
for a year later. But to your point, it's a really good one. The timing of is it a standard 1 month, 6 months, and we don't think about why? It really goes back to, well, what are we training people? What's the change? So if
Hmm.
you're teaching people how to facilitate troubleshooting conversations at a call center, let's say you're hiring call center staff. I'm using this example because I did this training. I was a director of training for a call center, so I'm very familiar with that work.
Hmm.
Um, but if you're training people who are working at a call center and you're training them on a framework that they should do with every single call, well, they're having how many calls a day? 10, 100? And so when do we follow up with people? It might be multiple times a day.
Hmm.
Maybe it's
Yeah.
daily. If
Yeah.
we're training people on how to fill out the paperwork and facilitate conversations with their supervisees around their performance, and you only have biannual performance reviews, well, then we probably want to train people as close to the time of that performance review. Then they do the performance review. After the performance review period is over, if the training was all about that, then we follow up. So it's not
Hmm.
necessarily is it 1 month, 6 months. It's about when are people going to do the thing that we're training them to
Yeah.
do? How
No, I think
frequently
that's
is
great
that? Yeah,
because
and that's the best time. Yeah,
I can very easily see it just becoming, well, we always do it at like 6 weeks and 3 months or
exactly.
whatever, and that's not relevant. There are things where There are there are instances, unfortunately, where we do have to train people for something. Like if I'm teaching you to recognize the sign of money laundering, I don't have any control over when you need that information.
True. That's
But I
true.
also
Yeah.
need to, it's something that still needs to happen. And then the whole world of compliance is its own thing. We've got about
Hmm.
10, 12 minutes left. I want to make sure we get to some people's questions. Nicole, did you see anything in particular we should jump on in questions? Otherwise, I will try to skim through.
Yeah, just earlier, I think somebody did answer it. They did ask for the reference for the combi model again.
Oh,
So
thank you.
yes.
Hmm.
Okay, great. I know I saw one question where somebody, we were sort of saying 15% is too low, but 75% is great and aspirational. But what is kind of a threshold that you see where, unless we're getting it to about this point, we probably have I mean, obviously more is always better, but what's a kind of threshold that you see with that?
So if you're talking about research from a
Hmm.
research perspective, we want 10% of your overall target population is okay, but 30% is great.
Hmm. Okay.
So we basically just want representative data. We
Hmm.
want to not, the 10% range. But again, it's also, if you're talking about 100 people and you get, 10% of that, um, that's not the best. But if we can get toward that 30%, and if I know we talked about having anonymous data collection, but you can do confidential, but not necessarily anonymous. I actually am a
Mm.
big fan of having like a unique identifier that would make the data confidential potentially, but we can see the demographic characteristics. So, do we have, let's say we have an onboarding class and we throw together people from all different departments and all different roles. I would be really curious to know the the age, the role they've been hired into, the department that they're working for. Like, are we getting survey responses from just one department, or are we getting them from as a few different departments that were all participating in that onboarding program? So we really want to see a representative response. How we then use maybe unique identifiers to see if we got representative responses and why or why not. That is really the idea, that we can get a sense that people from these different places throughout the cohort, the community, the organization, etc., that's the best way to know that we've at least got one person from each department giving us feedback. But if it's not representative, then we're not going to be able to understand what's going on and have integrity in how we use the data and how we talk about outcomes.
Yeah, yeah. And I think to your point, like and I think there's a comment from Mark Niles about like if you have 25 people, 30% is, like the bigger your sample size, the more that
Yeah,
percentage kind of has an
can
impact. And
be
we're not going to get
fluctuate.
into the
That's
the
right.
statistics of it all here,
Right.
but
Right.
if they would like to have that conversation with you, they can totally hire you to have that conversation with them.
That's right. Yeah, I like to
Um,
say that we don't need to be researchers. Like someone mentioned in the chat, randomized controlled trial, have a control group, have a intervention group. I don't think that we should ever be striving for that because it's a waste of resources. Because
hmm,
then how do you determine who's the control group versus the intervention group? Because in order to have that level of integrity around your data, you have to be able to control for outlying influences.
yeah.
And so it's difficult to say, oh, this group of people who, 10 years ago, we didn't have an onboarding training. And so that's our control group. We didn't have onboarding, in 2010, and then we started onboarding in 2020. So let's compare. Well, I mean, there are so many other factors that can influence the control group that happened a year ago or 10 years ago. So at the end of the day, I always tell people we want to have enough data that's representative and then be able to see trends. All we really need is to see trends in what's happening
Hmm.
and be able to compare it to what we expect to happen. So the example I used earlier about a program that was meant to build habits, did people do the activities at the cadence that we wanted to see them do them so that they would build those habits? Do we see that trend line going up, or is it staying neutral, or is it going down? Those trends can help us to know, are we going to move the needle for those people or not? And so, someone, I think, Renata, should we build a strategy that around objectives and activities? And absolutely. Our survey strategy and data collection strategy should totally align with the outcomes and objectives that we want to influence in our programs. And the
Hmm.
data should help us know, did we do what we said we were going to do or not, and why, so that we can then make choices about what to do differently in the future.
Yeah, and I think there's a big push towards like standardizing all of this and getting, everything to look exactly the same. And it gives us kind of that cleaner data on the back end so we can do some of those things. But I think the thing we do need to watch out for is the idea that that communicates that this is all machine and it's not really about you and
Mhm.
it's really about
Right.
these kinds of things. So yeah, no, one of the things that I was thinking about in the elephant book, but also just like what is the format of what we're doing communicate to people? Does it communicate that we care
Mhm.
about you and that this is personal and somebody's paying attention and all of those kinds of things, or does it communicate that this is a machine and nobody's really listening and this is all
Mhm.
perfunctory and it's all going to go into the void or things like that. So asking those questions, I think around the automatic, like the fact that people, I mean, I know that I clean a ton of survey requests out of my email and would like them to go away forever and stop bugging me about it because I'm not going to ever answer them. But it's created this kind of automatic, like dumping of survey stuff. And I
Mhm.
think that that's an interesting design problem of how do we interrupt that? How do we interrupt
Yeah.
some people's automatic behaviors about some of these kinds of things? Like I have some questions that I will have people answer when they join my Facebook group, and I put a little parenthetical message in there saying, no, I really do read these. Like, I
Mhm.
actually care
Yeah.
about this and it actually
Yeah.
makes a difference because I do. I do. I read all of them. But yeah, so there's some stuff. Nicole, any other questions that we want to have? Did you see anything else that we should jump on or?
Yeah, the only thing that I saw earlier, I thought it was interesting. I don't know if you all have any insight. It was asking about in the combi model how there's a two-way arrow between motivation and behavior. And they wanted to know, is that intentional or
I think it is, and I think I've asked Susan about it and gotten her explanation, and I will admit I just don't actually remember what it is right now, but I'm pretty sure it's on purpose. We'll send out a link to the recording and links to follow up on some of this stuff after the fact if for everyone who registered here today, and I'll see if I can't dig up an answer to the two-way arrow. I'm pretty sure there was a reason for it, and I think I've even heard the explanation, and now I just can't pull it out of my head at this moment. But one thing the comment from the most recent comment in the chat was about not looking at trends, which actually I love that comment about trends because I think that's something super important. We have a tendency to focus on, well, we got this rating, but really, there's so
Mhm.
much value to being able to see like numbers go up or go down or things like that. And I think as our workplaces become increasingly data driven, we have some options for that because obviously there's just a whole different level of like information and data in workplaces where data is. I was talking to somebody who worked for a food chain thing, and he was telling me that he can roll out a video on like serving efficiency, customer like efficiency for serving customers, and then can roll it out in 40 stores over here and compare it to 40 stores where he didn't roll it out and see if there's because they're measuring that. Like they know how many customers per hour are being served and they can see if it bumped up over here, but it didn't bump up over here. And so they can actually do some of that, comparison to a sample and A/B and those kinds of things. And so we'll have some of those capabilities kind of going forward. Of course, they need to not be misused.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
and Nicole is doing a great job as we've got a minute or two left of dropping in some links. But let me just switch this. If you want to follow up more with Alaina, there's a link to your website. Nicole's dropped it into the chat. Also, you were mentioning that reaching out to you on LinkedIn is a good source. You also, I think, do a phenomenal job of keeping up with a really regular newsletter, which I admire very much because I'm anything but regular with my newsletters. But that is so. And if people have follow-up questions, what's the best way to kind of reach out or just
LinkedIn.
Mhm.
LinkedIn messaging is like my second email inbox. I do a lot of communication and outreach also on LinkedIn. So it's a great place to find me. So feel free to connect, say hello, say that you participated in today's session. And if you have any specific questions, at the end of the day, data is only so useful as our thoughtfulness in designing how we're collecting it. And it's worth being no today we talked about getting people to respond to surveys, but I would also suggest that survey fatigue is real. And so is there a way to get useful data without surveying people?
Mhm. Yep.
And some ways back to that culture of understanding survey and data collection. If people understand that you're only using surveys because there's not any other way to collect data to investigate trends and outcomes and results, I think people will really appreciate that. So just being Going back to your behavior model, the capability pieces, just your take home message, I think, is you, as the designer of surveys, have everything to do with the motivation of the user responses.
Yep.
So if we're seeing low response rates, it's likely that your design of that survey is very weak. And so, what can you do to change it? Think about your own experience as a survey taker. When
Hmm.
when do you when are you most likely to respond to surveys? What kinds of questions and kinds of data feedback experiences do you really appreciate? And doing more of that will have a huge influence on increasing your survey response rates.
Yeah. I think there's so much more, like we could just totally follow some of these threads out, and maybe
Mhm.
we'll have to have a subsequent conversation. But thank you so much for joining us and for all of this stuff. This is really such an interesting issue to me because I think it has been so sticky and so difficult for so
Mhm.
long. And so finding some ways to kind of crack it open and do something different, I think is pretty amazing. I'll give you guys the links here too. As I mentioned, the Facebook group, if people want to follow up there and ask additional questions, I'm happy to, address stuff there. And I will do the shout outs for some of the stuff that's coming up. I have a workshop in a couple of weeks on skills development, and I will have to think about what my survey feedback mechanism is going to be for that because I think I definitely want to do one, but I need to now I have all sorts of great ideas for how to think about that. If you would like to know about that, you can find that at the usable learning site that Nicole put in the chat. And otherwise, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming. And thanks for all of the active conversation in the chat. And
Yeah.
you're all amazing. And everybody have a really great rest of your day. And thanks
Thanks for
again to
Thanks
having me,
so
Nicole
Julie.
much.
for jumping in at the last minute to help out with this one. I really appreciate it. So
Have a great day, everyone.